If I come to God with an arrogant heart, will God listen and answer my prayers? You know, it actually really matters how you come to God. And Jesus, in this parable in Luke chapter 18, addresses this issue. Let's go ahead and take a look. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells the parable about two different men and their different heart attitudes as they approach God. This parable is really easy to structure. First, there's why Jesus tells this parable. And then there are two men. There's the Pharisee. He comes to God and he prays. Then there's the tax collector, and he comes to God and he comes to God in prayer. The final thing about this parable, the final portion, is there's a conclusion. And it's something we're kind of like the application we're to draw from this parable. Let's take a closer look. First, why does Jesus tell this parable? Well, Jesus told this parable, it says this, to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and also to some who treated others with contempt. So really there's kind of two issues that Jesus is addressing here. There's the people who they're trusting in themselves, they're thinking they're righteous. Second, there are people who they consider themselves to be better than everybody else, and they're looking on others with contempt. Notice that Jesus is speaking this parable to these kinds of people. He's not just talking about them. He might, like you might talk to your disciples and say, you know, those people over there, they're really bad. No, Jesus is actually speaking to these people, which adds a different kind of dynamic to this parable, I think. It shows us that Jesus is confronting people here. He's looking to point out a sin in their life and address it and call them to repent. So Jesus speaks this parable to these people. That's why he's telling this story. Okay, now in this parable, there are two men. Let's take a look at these two guys. Here in verse 10, it says this, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. Notice the setting for this parable that Jesus tells, the temple. The temple is, of course, the most precious part of Judaism. It's the most sacred place, we should say, in Judaism. This is where people would go to talk to God. They would go to bring their sacrifices to God, to worship God. This is a sacred place. They're praying, and there are 2 men. First, there's a Pharisee. Now, you would maybe expect to see a Pharisee at the temple praying. The Pharisees were a part of an extremely strict religious sect. And really, there's not a lot of people, I think, in our society today that really would look like a Pharisee would have looked. These are guys that they really kind of trusted in their own righteousness. Just like Jesus was saying earlier, he was addressing people who did what? Well, these are people that they trust in their own righteousness. That's what a Pharisee did often. They were extremely strict about the law of Moses, and boy, did they keep the law good. And they were kind of prideful sometimes. Jesus, in fact, is often found rebuking the Pharisees. Often as you read the Gospels, what you find is it's Jesus and the Pharisees, and they're going back and forth. There's a Pharisee who comes to pray. You'd expect to see him in a temple, but here's someone you wouldn't expect to see, a tax collector. Now, you know things about tax collectors. Everybody hates the tax collectors. They were often pretty unfair in how they went about their business. They're collecting taxes, not for the Jewish government, but for the Roman government. And so just think about this. Every year, money is being farmed out of Israel, just year after year after year. And that's not going to help build roads in Israel. That's going to help the Roman government. So to be a tax collector was really often seen to be a sinner. It was seen to be a traitor to the Jewish people. And often these were pretty shady guys. They would show up and they'd say, hey, listen, here's how much money you got to pay. And there's no appeals process. Rome doesn't really care if they make a few extra bucks on the side. So you just got to pay or else face the consequences. this guy is maybe not the kind of person you would expect God to listen to. But let's listen to their two prayers. First, the Pharisee. Notice how the Pharisee prays. He stands by himself, and here we find the content of his prayer. But I want you to notice something. This prayer isn't God-centered, it's him-centered. Look at this. I. This is all about me. And it's not a prayer of humility, it's really a prayer more of bragging. He starts saying, God, I thank you, but he's not really thanking God for blessings that God has given him. He's thanking God, God, thanks that I'm better than everybody else. I thank you. And then he compares himself. Remember, Jesus is addressing those who they considered them, they trusted themselves in their own righteousness, and then they had contempt on other people. And here comes the contempt. Thank you that I'm not like other men. And he starts comparing himself to the extortioners, the unjust, the adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Can you hear the contempt? Maybe he's looking out of the corner of his eye back there at the tax collector. Thanks God that I'm not like that guy. And he kind of assumes that this is the prayer that God will accept. This is the kind of thing that will get God's attention. God, take notice at my righteousness. That's prayer number 1. And notice, I should notice as well, verse 12, he doesn't just compare himself to other people, but he brags about the things he does. We shouldn't fail to mention that. He says, I fast twice a week, and I give tithes of all that I get. Now, those are great things to do. You should fast. You should be generous and give tithes. These aren't wicked things that he's doing. The issue isn't that he's doing something wrong. It's that he is very arrogant in what he's doing, and he's trusting in his own righteousness. He's thinking, this is how I get right with God. I'm the kind of person that God will answer my prayer. But is that really the case? So that's prayer number 1. Let's look now at the tax collector, and let's look at his prayer. Notice how different the tax collector is as he comes to God in prayer. But the tax collector standing far off. So notice a couple of things about just the very posture and the very actions before we even get to the prayer. Notice these things. He's standing afar off. It's like he knows he's not good enough to even come near to God. Then this, he would not even lift up his eyes to heaven. It's like he won't even look at God. Then look, he beat his breast. It's like he's wailing almost. He's in anguish over his sin. So we haven't even got to his prayer yet, and you see something different about this man. He's standing far away, won't even look at God, beating his breast, and now we get the prayer. And it's just beautiful. It's so simple. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He notices that he needs God's mercy. He knows he's not righteous. He knows he deserves God's punishment. And so it's right for him to come to God and say, God, I need mercy. I need you to help me and give me mercy. Why? Because I am a sinner. Talk about a different kind of prayer. This is not the kind of man you would expect to see at the temple. And yet, his prayer is very different. And I want you to notice that God treats the two men very differently. And it shows us that it really actually matters how we approach God. Look at this in verse 14. Jesus says, I tell you this man. Which man? Not the Pharisee, but this man, the tax collector. This man went down to his house justified. He went down to his house because you're in the temple, and so you go down. The temple is up, everything else is down. He goes down to his house justified rather than the other. In other words, one man is justified, the other is not. The first man, the Pharisee, you would think he's the man that God would listen to his prayer, but he came to God with the wrong attitude. God didn't respect his prayer. God didn't honor that prayer. He disregarded it. It reminds me of the verse that says, God rejects the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Why did God reject this man's prayer and yet make sure that this man is justified? Here's the reason. We're going to get the reason for why things work out this way. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. See, that's how God acts. That's how God responds to prayer. God isn't looking at the outside shininess of your good deeds. God is looking at your heart. And I think that matters to us because it shows us something. It matters how we approach God. As we go through life, as we just think about how do I relate to God, and then especially as we go to God in prayer, it matters that we don't say, God, I thank you that I've basically got my life in order, and here's what I need. No, we need to come to God in incredible humility, realizing that in our sin, we need God. Someone who isn't saved, you need to realize you can't earn your way into heaven. You can't look at yourself and say, God, let me into heaven because I'm a good person. You need to have the attitude of the tax collector. Someone who is saved needs to stop and think, am I coming to God with a humble attitude in my prayers? How do you relate to God? God requires and blesses a humble heart and a humble prayer. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us in this series on the works and words of Christ. We'll see you guys next time.